Okay, I think we're going to get started. We know we have other people en route, including one of our panelists. They're in traffic. It happens. But we will welcome anybody who shows up along the way. I just want to greet everyone. I'm William Boyd, professor here at UCLA Law and also a professor in the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. We're really excited for this event on fixing the climate, strategies for an uncertain world. Before we get started, I want to thank UCLA Law. I want to thank the Emmett Institute team, especially Heather Morphew, for making this happen. I want to thank Dan Emmett, who I think is on live stream. Thank you, Dan, for your support and leadership. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'll introduce the panelists and then say a little bit about how we will proceed. First up, our two authors. Charles Sabel is the Maurice T. Moore Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. David Victor is Professor of Innovation and Public Policy and co-director of the Deep Decarbonization Initiative at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. This is, I think, the first time they've been together in person since they wrote the book together. So this is what we do at UCLA. We bring people together. Next to David is Ted Parson, the Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law and Faculty Director at the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment here at UCLA Law. Mary Nichols is not here. She's on the way in traffic, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. She's Distinguished Counsel at the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA Law. She's the former chair of the California Air Resources Board under both Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Brown. She was also California Secretary of Natural Resources and Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation at EPA during the Clinton administration. Steve Cliff, all the way down there on the end, is the Executive Officer at the California Air Resources Board, and before that he was the Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, a job now held by our own Ann Carlson. And last but not least, Kim Klausing is the Eric M. Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy here at UCLA Law. Before joining UCLA, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis in the U.S. Department of Treasury, serving as the lead economist in the Office of Tax Policy in the Biden administration. It's an all-star cast, obviously, a mix of academics and real-world regulators, a truly interdisciplinary mix. By my count, we have a chemist, an economist, two lawyers, a political scientist, and two polymaths from the Kennedy School of Government. I want to thank all of you for being here. And let me just say that this is a lot more than just a book talk. But we do have books available right outside, and I know that David and Chuck would be willing to sign a copy if you're interested. We're treating tonight as the first in a series of events on climate solutions that the Emmett Institute will be hosting, so please do watch this space for more events like this in the future. So the plan for the evening. So I'm going to ask each of the authors, Chuck and David, to say a few things about the book and some of the key arguments and claims that they make in the book. I'm then going to ask the other participants to respond to a particular aspect of the book's main arguments and claims. We hope to get some back and forth going among the group as we do that. Once everyone has had a chance to speak, we'll then spend a little more time in open discussion with the group to give people a chance to engage on anything else they want to discuss. Then we'll open it up for Q&A with all of you in the audience, and we will call on people if you don't have questions, so please be thinking of questions. We'll close with a brief lightning round with an impossible question that I will pose to our panel here, and then we'll end at roughly 7 o'clock, and there'll be a reception out there, and copies of the book will be available. So let's get started. A few quick framing remarks from me. This is a very different book than most books on climate policy in a very refreshing way. It offers a novel, important, and I would argue revisionist take on climate policy that is grounded in what the authors call experimentalist governance. Part of the message is that the decades-long quest for a consent-based treaty regime capable of responding to climate change has not delivered and has distracted from the necessary work of building and elaborating experimentalist regimes that can solve the many varied and variable problems that are wrapped up in the broader climate challenge. And as the book makes clear, when we look around the world, we see at all levels of governance examples of experimentalist governance, real-world problem solving that are already underway, making real progress in climate and other related areas. Finding ways to create and sustain more of that means opening up and challenging some of our traditional conceptions of governance, looking hard at the institutional design features that have allowed innovative experimentalist problem solving to flourish in key areas. And in a world of great uncertainty, which is another key theme of the book, a world of great uncertainty about what will work and how to solve particular problems, the book makes a very strong argument that this form of experimentalist governance is necessary to make real progress. It may not be sufficient by itself, but it is necessary for sure. And it's happening all over the world, which is why in the end, this is a really hopeful book. And I think that's one of the most important things to take away this evening. So we'll start with Chuck Sabel. And I'll ask you, Chuck, to say a bit about how you came to write the book and the basic theory of experimentalist governance that it elaborates.
So first of all, a giant thank you, William, and to our co-panelists. This is an extremely welcome occasion because we haven't had a chance to reflect with each other and publicly, and because of the chance to exchange views with people on whom we've drawn fundamentally in writing the book, and whose reaction to the book is therefore at least as interesting as the book itself, meaning that if there's a conflict and we can't resolve it, it's decided in favor of the critic. So let me say briefly, because I do want to leave as much time, there are 7 of us, and want to leave time for as much discussion as possible. David and I discussed at lunch today for the first time why we wrote the book. And you may be...
We probably should have done it earlier.
Well, the good news is we concluded we're glad we did. We didn't come to the conclusion that on reflection it was a bad idea. And we have complementary aims. So let me very, very briefly say mine. So I have, as to many things, a peculiar relation to book writing. I think books should put the author at risk. If you know how a book is going to come out, and unless you're absolutely sure that that's a revelation to the world, you might think twice about writing it. And that a book should be an exploration and a test of one's own deepest ideas. Not a final test, but a test that reveals, at least to the author and to sympathetic readers, the possibilities and limits of a certain approach. In my case, the background ideas go back because I started out in academic life a long time ago, but with the conviction, not the certitude, but a gathering sense of near inevitability that the post-war order of mass production, of the trading regime that went with it, the environmental circumstances attendant and all that, was falling apart. That was obvious in the 80s and 90s, and the question was, not would it be replaced in a flash, that was inconceivable, but could it be replaced by some forms of governance that would provide democratic accountability in a period of massive transformation away from a deeply embedded set of production circumstances, political practices, understandings of democracy, and so on and so forth. And much of my work has been devoted to examining those possibilities. Experimentalist governance is supposed to be address the question of how you can have a rule of law that is both flexible enough to accommodate deep uncertainty and accountable to democratic norms. How is that? Is that inconceivable, or is it possible? And if it's inconceivable, then this transition is almost doomed from the beginning. If it's possible, are there some ways that articulating its possibility could increase the probability of a good outcome? So that was one consideration. And the second consideration, and here I confess to being slow to come to the party, it slowly dawned on me as time went on that climate change was at least as fundamental a transformation in the organization of the deep structures of society as any of the kinds of productive reorganizations that more traditional leftists of the kind from which I spring thought of as the driving mechanisms for social change. So climate change came to seem as an inevitable challenge that we had to face and could only be seriously faced if we actually went some distance in transforming our society. So the ambition was to see whether experimentalism could be applied to this transition under the strict condition that what we said about climate change and experimentalism had to be not just convincing, but attractive and compelling to people who really know what they're talking about. So this book is a double endeavor from my point of view, and David will say, will add a complementary piece. From my point of view, to both further exploration of this very large agenda of thinking about the possibilities of cumulatively transformative transformation under conditions of strict attention to the exigencies of climate change, with therefore the need for adult supervision.
Was that my job?
Well, that's the old joke is, what's the difference between the Marines and the Boy Scouts? And the answer is the Boy Scouts have adult supervision. So I'm here, the Boy Scout, and the book would not have been possible, at least would not have approached meeting the standard that I just articulated without the full participation of David. So,
Well, thank you, Chuck. Thank you, William, and thanks to all of you for doing this. It's really a special pleasure for us because we've never given a book talk together about the book. And so not only do we enjoy some great Iranian food earlier today and talking about why we wrote the book and agreeing it was a good idea, but it's also a chance to share what we've learned and to learn from you. So it's really quite an honor. I want to pick up on what Chuck was talking about and explain why I got excited about this project. This took us a long time. It took us 8 years to write this book. Some books write very quickly, some books take a while. I'm going to comment on that in the end of my remarks. I wrote this book because starting 10 years or so ago, it became clear to me, as someone who works on climate change, has worked on climate change for a long time, since I think just after the Civil War, that the debate had really changed. No longer was the question, do people believe in the science? I mean, that's a question, it's a perennial question. It's a full employment program for people who worry about that stuff. But instead, what you saw were some firms and some governments that knew they had to do something, and then they were grappling with the reality that it was going to be really difficult, and the course was unknown and unknowable. You couldn't kind of work harder on it, hire more scientists and engineers and figure that out. And so I was interested in is that enough? Is it enough to have some actors that are highly motivated to go off and do something, even if they have no idea really what they're doing? So that required going actually to theory and to history, and that's what brought us together at a seminar at Brown University, which we attended. I attended remotely because we had just had a baby, and so it took us, I think, halfway through the project, we actually met each other in person for the first time.
Could you speak closer
Sure.
to the mic, please?
So that was the first reason, is I saw a shift in the politics.
The mic switched on.
Mic is switched on.
Yeah.
Are there any other complaints about the microphone? Okay, excellent. So the first reason was that I had seen a big shift in the politics and wanted to understand what would motivate that. The book has a lot of discussion about what's called a penalty default, an extreme penalty like loss of license to operate, which is conditional upon effort, but really motivates firms to search for a wide range of possible solutions, not to think about these problems as compliance problems, but to search very widely. That's the first reason. The second reason is that when you looked out to history, you saw a lot of examples of successful problem solving that started to look a lot like this. You know, they maybe weren't as hard as climate change, but they had a lot of the same attributes. Ted Parson, who's going to talk in just a moment, studied ozone layer. And that's a set piece for the book, is how is it that we actually address the ozone layer problem seriously? Because when you go back in time, you realize that people actually didn't know exactly what to do. They set ambitious goals, and they went off and ran experiments, and they learned quickly what was possible, what wasn't possible. They made adjustments along the way. Acid rain, same story. Cleaning up air pollution in California, same story. And you started to see this rhyme over and over again. A third of this book is actually history. It's retelling history that we all thought we knew, but through the lens of experimentalism and what that means. And so the goal here was a hopeful book, so thank you, William, for picking up on that. There's enough doom and gloom in the climate business. It was a hopeful book, but one guided by a theory of change and an effort to articulate what that theory of change is, and also what that means for institutional design. What can you do with global diplomacy? What do you need to do in smaller groups, and so on. If I could just say two last things before I hand the microphone over. One is about why it took so long. I was on a call last week with some people actually from Hollywood commenting on why have some studios done, Pixar famously, had so many successes when there are so many terrible movies out there. What explains that? And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that they were not afraid to just stop and redirect and rethink. And so I would say that halfway through the book writing process, we maybe threw out half the book, rewrote, hired an editor. We did all kinds of other things, and the book benefited from slowing down rather than speeding up. And the last thing I'll say is, what a joy, as we were finishing this book, to see more governments and firms adopt this theory of change. This is the way the British government hosted the Glasgow conference. Sure, they did the global diplomacy. We had arguments over commas in the middle of the night, which is literally true. But then they also organized groups of firms that were willing to go change facts on the ground. They were highly motivated to go do things. And they went off and changed those facts on the ground. And by doing that, created new industries and made it riskier for the other firms in that same industry to drag their feet. And that theory of change was informed in no small degree by this writing project. And so it's been really a great pleasure to see that start to unfold in the real world.
Great, thank you. So before we go to Ted, to Steve, and to Kim, I do want to kind of get a little more out for the audience here as to the actual theory of experimentalist governance. So Chuck, maybe you could say a bit more about the key features of that and the kind of two categories that you identify in the book, innovation at the technological frontier and contextualization. And then David, I would love it if you would say a bit more about the Montreal Protocol and how we took the wrong lessons from Montreal. And in fact, the book does a great job, I think, of suggesting what the right lessons are. And then we'll go to Ted, who can sort of reinforce a lot of that and give us his take on Montreal and climate policy. So,
Okay, experimentalism is a theory about a governance under uncertainty. And the famous distinction, Frank Knight's distinction, is between risk when you can calculate the probability of a known set of outcomes. You don't know what's going to happen, but you can calculate the probability. And uncertainty, where you can't list all the outcomes that are eventually possible. And one view, a standard view, is that under uncertainty, rational decision-making is impossible because you can't weigh the alternatives. And rational decision-making is about choosing the appropriate alternative given feasible actions. So the claim that, but of course, in the real world, people don't just abandon decision-making when things get uncertain. They turn to a series of strategies for learning, for probing alternatives, for generating alternatives. But that set of activities is regarded as anomalous. There's no systematic account of that. Experimentalism tries to be. It's absolutely not a comprehensive and successful account of decision-making under uncertainty, but it tries to focus on decision-making under uncertainty to show that there are a set of characteristic incentives and characteristic problems that arise once you understand that you're not dealing with risk, but you're dealing with large transformations where the ultimate outcome can't be predicted in advance. Now, let me just illustrate the scope of this to come to this question about different kinds of technological frontiers, because one part of the discussion of decision-making under uncertainty has a kind of familiar face, even if it's not a theoretically sophisticated face, and that's the idea of industrial policy. People know that when things get very difficult, you have to have boffins, so pointy heads go and try new stuff, and we can organize that, and we have DARPA and ARPA-E, and we have, there's a whole bunch of writing about the success of industrial policies in these very difficult circumstances. So there's a handhold for a theory of decision-making under uncertainty at the high technological frontier, where everybody has to agree that the science and the technology runs out. That's why it's the high frontier. An important claim of the book is that while that's true, that it does run out at that frontier, green steel or something, the same kinds of uncertainty reappear at the local level when you actually start to apply in place-specific, context-specific settings general solutions that may be technologically or scientifically feasible, but whose actual instantiation can't be anticipated from the general solution, and whose eventual successful configuration may change your understanding of what the actual, what is in the feasible set of realizations of the solution. So this is important because it's a way of acknowledging and putting a light on the question of whether this transformation is basically a technocratic, is a matter left to technocrats who can figure out the right way to progress in these industries, as opposed to requiring something like a broad movement that involves people, not just in environmental justice, but in communities, in agriculture, and certainly the global South, in a wide-ranging set of transformations that are going to have very profound influences on the world trading pattern, on the balance of power between the North and the South, and so on and so forth. So this is highly compressed, but the two elements I want to just underscore are, first, that it's the idea is to do something that seems quixotic, to have to begin to theorize decision-making under uncertainty when uncertainty is supposed to defeat decision-making. And not only that, but to say that exposure to uncertainty and the set of policies needed to address it are going to be as relevant to broad populations as to the elites that are involved in frontier innovation.
Beautiful. Now, David, if you could apply that to the Montreal Protocol and the lessons that come out of Montreal.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the ozone layer.
And maybe remind people
Yeah.
about,
So if you rewind the tape of history, half of you, I think, were not even in the womb at that time, but the rest of us will remember this. If you rewind the tape of history back to the early 1980s, a bunch of science had come out, partly from Irvine, just south of here, to lay out the basic chemistry for why the ozone would be depleted by chlorofluorocarbons and other kinds of chemicals. And then a hole was suddenly detected in the ozone layer. It's one of those detections that's a little bit like these balloons. There have been balloons floating over all the time, but we set the radar parameters so that we weren't looking for balloons. We were looking for warheads, and we weren't seeing warheads. We were happy with that, but then suddenly we started looking for balloons. We changed the way the instruments operate, and now we're seeing balloons. It was the same thing with the ozone. The ozone hole was there, but we said there can't be a ozone hole there, so we weren't looking for it, and boom, we found it. In the fall of 1987, a treaty, the Montreal Protocol, was signed in September that laid out very aggressive goals to do something about the ozone layer problem. We didn't know at that time what was causing the ozone hole. The key experiments, which were on a converted U-2 spy plane, were actually flown a month later. And so key science came in afterwards. People often think we have to wait for more certainty to act. Exactly as Chuck says, this is in fact a way of looking for solutions even before the science is in, even before the engineering around different solutions came in. You had enough firms that were motivated to do something about it, concerned about brand like DuPont. You had enough governments that were motivated to do something about this in the industrialized countries principally. Some, like the United States, had already done a little bit about it, but not a lot. Others had done nothing and been dragging their feet. So there was a motivation to do something, but nobody really knew exactly what to do. So what they do in the Montreal Protocol is they set very ambitious goals, chemical class by chemical class, not just broad goals, but by classes of chemicals. And then firms were motivated to go search for solutions because there were going to be opportunities in those new markets and also risks if you didn't make the shift. The firms didn't know what solutions would exist. They didn't know if in some cases the solutions were found by changing the chemicals that were used in refrigerants or used in other kinds of applications. In other cases, as Ted's work has shown very clearly, they found ways of doing things they were doing before, but without the chemicals altogether, like soldering, cleaning solder boards. And so these were some of them were kind of partially known or thought of, but were unknown and to some degree unknowable at the time. And what we do in the book is we go back and we retell this history, and we tell it through the lens of how the firms and governments learned quickly, often by collaborating with each other. In fact, the United States government had the capacity to reduce antitrust action on collaborating firms in this area. So it made possible the pooled search for solutions, and by pooling knowledge, lowering risks. And then they learned quickly what was possible, what was not possible. One of the most important innovations in the Montreal Protocol is a set of committees that allowed technical experts and industry experts to collaborate together to talk about those solutions and then to socialize and centralize that knowledge in ways that could then adjust the targets. Sometimes the targets were adjusted so they were more aggressive, sometimes they were relaxed, and it was this evolution of the commitments alongside the actual experience on the ground. And one other thing that happened in the Montreal Protocol is very important, is we invested directly in building those institutions in developing countries. And so the developing countries over time had the capacity to participate in the same way and had the same incentives, which is not to be investing in the technologies of the past, but to be investing in the technologies of the future markets because there was such risk in investing in older technologies. If that sounds a lot like the climate change problem, then you see it through our lens. What was so interesting to me as we relearned this history really, and then wrote it in the book, and learned a lot from Ted's work and others, is that the architects of the climate change diplomatic agreements looked at climate change and they said, hey, we just worked on a global environmental problem, we were great at it, let's do the same thing. And so they thought they were taking the lessons from the Montreal Protocol and applying them directly to climate. And it is hard for them to have done a worse job because they took all the wrong lessons and ignored all the right lessons. The wrong lessons they took were it's about a global agreement that's legally binding, that has aggressive targets and timetables, and has almost no capacity for real flexibility around that. And so that was written into the agreement, basically. That became the Kyoto Protocol and was a dead end. What they ignored, or actually debated, as we show in the book, debated and then specifically ignored, were how do we create committees that include industry? How do we learn what's working in these experiments and not working in these experiments? How do we keep the targets, the goals in the agreement, lined up with the actual evolutionary experience on the ground? And so that's kind of an example of what we're trying to do in the book, in going back and revisiting history with the benefit of the theory of experimentalism, and then the guide for what should be happening in climate.
So is it fair to say the triumph of Montreal was in some ways tied to the institutional design and the way in which they were designing for uncertainty?
Yeah, and I think that it's too easy to say, ozone was easy, climate is hard, and therefore we should ignore the real lessons of ozone.
Speaking of the lessons from ozone, our own Ted Parson has written the book on the efforts to protect the ozone layer, and it is cited widely in Fixing the Climate. So Ted, I want to turn it over to you and ask you to reflect a bit on how the book talks about Montreal, but also the lessons that we should all take from Montreal, sort of reinforcing what David has been saying around institutional design and how that can maybe get sort of embedded in a new climate regime.
Great. Thank you, William. So I just want to congratulate Chuck and David. This is really a fabulous book. It's really wonderful for the scope and accuracy of the empirical research and for the boldness and novelty of the theoretical claims. It's not a thick book, but it's vast in scope and ambition. And there's of course, far too much rich stuff to address here. So I'll zoom in on stratospheric ozone, Montreal Protocol and its implications, and even within that, my discussion is going to have to be perfunctory. So thank you. You got it right in 3 important ways that almost all commentators on the Montreal Protocol get it wrong. David, as you just said, most observers say ozone was easy, climate is hard, and therefore there's limited applicability of insights from the one to the other. That's really wrong. And you also get it right in 2 more particular ways. The main way in which it was not easy was that the key innovations in the technologies necessary to reduce use of ozone-depleting chemicals came after the crucial steps of imposition of regulatory controls, not before. If you remember one thing from this talk, remember that. You will hear the contrary all over the place, and it is authoritatively rebutted by the historical record. It's really surprising to me that people continue to get this wrong. The third thing you get right is the recognition that the crucial innovation of the Montreal Protocol was not the fact of getting a terrific, treaty with quite tight controls in the first place. It was the way that initial move with the institutional decisions around it put in motion a set of positive feedbacks between private industry-driven innovation and repeated adjustment and tightening of regulatory requirements to drive essentially towards zero. The key piece of that was mediated by the set of technical committees that David just referred to, which were an astonishing achievement. There was no precedent for that success before, and there's really been no effective imitation of it ever since. They succeeded in mobilizing the highest levels of private sector technical expertise and harnessing them to the public aim of protecting the environment, while still employed. One place where I would take issue with the arguments of the book is, I have to say, this is weird and uncomfortable for me to be a defender of the Kyoto Protocol, but I think you join too much in the bashing of the Kyoto Protocol because the differences that are so consequential are less obvious than I think most commentators have noted. Of course, you're correct overall. It was ineffective where the Montreal Protocol was widely effective, but both treaties are organized around quantitative national reduction targets. In the Montreal Protocol case, it's reduction of production and consumption of certain classes of chemicals. In Kyoto Protocol, it's reduction of emissions. Both of them included sort of measures inspired by a fondness for market-based policy measures to introduce some flexibility into the controls, although this was more limited and grudging in the Montreal case than in the Kyoto case. And both of them were taken with a clear sense that the first step didn't solve the problem. And if you look formally, there are provisions for repeated assessment and review of the controls in each treaty, and even a reference to expert assessment. Now, there's differences in these provisions, but there's other things that I think you might call kind of beyond the expertise or capability of the drafters of Kyoto that I think are centrally responsible for the difference in outcomes. First, the climate regime has nothing like the Montreal Protocol's expert assessment panels, but those emerged spontaneously around the edges of the treaty rather than being intrinsic to the treaty. Second, the Kyoto Protocol had the bad luck of falling into the maw of US domestic politics from the very start, indeed, even from before its adoption. And of course, it was a simpler, easier time, and so it was okay then to do a treaty that basically just had industrialized country participants in the first instance and then sort of broadened with serious attention to global inclusiveness in the second step. And maybe it mattered that they went first. The opponents, the target industries, were outmaneuvered by the institutional innovations in the Montreal Protocol, and it wasn't going to happen again. Let me just briefly reflect on the experience of the Montreal Protocol as it pertains to the three key points of your theoretical argument. And there's one that's especially interesting, so I'm going to deal with two very quickly and then a little more detail on one. Your first point of experimental governance, you call it an organizational structure. My interpretation of that is that you say it's a situation of shared authority or of limited exercise of authority, even when it formally exists. I think it would be useful to dig into the question of whether you actually regard that distribution of authority as an advantage, or whether you're making the more limited argument that it doesn't need to be disabling. You don't need concentrated authority. On your third point of what you call penalty defaults, in my ozone work, I call this regulatory threats, but I completely understand why you want a broader term that doesn't necessarily presume it's a single regulator that holds these threats. The essence of progress in Montreal, and I think many of the other regimes that you analyze, is the ability to hold outstanding a regulatory threat that's really severe, and you never have to drop the axe. So in a sense, I keep thinking of our late colleague Tom Schelling in this. It's like a threat that succeeds is the one you don't have to deliver on. But when you're dealing with a regime that is pushing an enormous transformation over decades, it's really puzzling how you can keep a threat outstanding and credible, never having to act on it. And indeed, I'm struck in your cases that there's few or no instances in which the axe actually falls. The penalty default is applied. It's present. It looms as a dangerous character around the edges. Finally, deliberation. You identify this as central. But the fact you use the term deliberation suggests to me that you're invoking the literature on democratic deliberation, and what's involved here is a kind of an exchange of both factual knowledge but also preferences and values in a kind of a democratic sense. And in the Montreal Protocol, it's shocking the degree to which the key deliberations were, at least initially during the crucial period, entirely technocratic in character. The technical committees that David referred to that brought industry expertise together to pose questions, how much, how fast can we cut in this use, in this use, in this use, they successfully brought in basically the world's strongest technical expertise in very specific questions. I mean, just imagine a meeting in Warsaw that has the world's top 15 experts on blowing insulating foams. Can you imagine how exciting it would be to be at such a gathering? Although I have to tell you, if you happen to be one of the world's top experts in blowing insulating foams, it actually was really exciting and you wanted to be there. But the key participation is by individual expertise, not by institutional or democratic or jurisdictional affiliation, because what they were doing in those rooms was rolling up their sleeves and solving real problems, very, very specific ones. The other shocking thing about these deliberations, I mean, it's anachronistic to talk about it in retrospect, but they lacked all procedural controls that people think as necessary for any legitimate collective decision-making process. They had no scientific peer review, because by assumption, the only peers were actually the people in the room. And more crucially, they had no transparency. It's like, you couldn't join. I was the leading scholar of this issue, and I asked 5 times, can I please come and sit in one of these meetings? And they said no. No, because it's the crucial technical disclosures required a kind of a protection from basically disclosures against interest. The people in that room were doing things that had their employers known in detail and in real time, they would have fired them or refused to let them come back. No procedural formality, initially no concern about breadth of participation as a basis for legitimacy. Over time, there was a real push toward broadening expertise and participation in these. So it is deliberation, but of a very particular sort that in a sense gained its legitimacy by its success. And in retrospect, it's astonishing that they could get away with setting it up that way. Maybe it was because it was a unique historical moment. There was a sense of urgency and novelty. Maybe, well, obviously, it's clear that partly this worked because the firms knew they needed this. They were under an already enacted, very threatening regulatory restriction, and they didn't know how they were going to do it and stay in business. And so, yeah, they were willing to send their top experts at their expense to a UN meeting for 2 weeks in Warsaw, to tell regulators how to control their business. It's like, shock. Last point, I can see, William, I'm going on a little too long. There was an ambiguity of purpose of these technical discussions that I think was central to their success. Ostensibly and formally, what the job of these bodies was to advise the parties to the Montreal Protocol on how much ozone-depleting chemicals could be reduced how fast. But the reason they got the participation they did was that the firms desperately needed these bodies in order to figure out how to keep doing what they were doing and staying in business. That was not an explicit mission, and there was never any formal or authoritative connection between the technical bodies and the Montreal Protocol. And perhaps it's that lack of an authoritative connection that allowed them to operate in the way they did that sort of violates every procedural norm. Over time, they accreted an extraordinary degree of influence and sort of got legitimacy in retrospect despite their mechanisms. Okay, that's I'm not going to talk about how to apply that to climate change. I'm going to stop there. Maybe we can get to that in discussion.
Yeah, we'll
Thank
come
you.
back to that, and I'm sure
Yeah.
David and Chuck may have some responses
Yep,
or some
thank you.
questions for you. But I do want to get to our real-world regulators who are here, and I want to welcome Mary Nichols. Thank you, Mary, for fighting traffic to get here. I've already introduced you to the group, and your illustrious career is known by just about everyone here. So this is a real test for the book, I think, is the extent to which some of our real-world regulators actually resonate with the theory of experimentalist governance. And so I want to turn to Mary Nichols and Steve Cliff, and then we'll close with Kim Klausing, who has just come from the Treasury Department. So the book celebrates, rightly so, the California Air Resources Board as a shining example of a regulatory agency that has been very effective in creating and sustaining the experimentalist approach as a way to drive innovation at the technological frontier. And the book gives particular attention to the low and zero emission vehicle program at ARB and the way in which California has been extremely effective in creating markets for new technologies and driving this. There are a range of factors at work here according to the book, and Chuck and David can weigh in on this, but it boils down to a combination of what they call penalty default. We've already heard this term a few times. These are, as I understand it, mechanisms that destabilize the status quo and focus the mind of regulated firms on compliance, but more importantly on innovation because of the uncertainty. And then more importantly, it seems to me, is the deep collaboration. The trust, the relationships between the regulators and the regulated community in problem solving and in keeping that process moving forward and keeping it sufficiently flexible to adjust when there are surprises and setbacks along the way. But it keeps moving forward in part because of that penalty default. The NAAQS program under the Clean Air Act, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards Program, has some features of this as well, and there are other examples in the book. But let's stay focused on ARB, since we have an all-star cast of ARB folks here with us. And so, Mary, let me turn to you first and ask you for your sort of reaction and reflections on the notion of experimentalist governance and the secret, in your view, to what the authors call the California miracle, referring to California's truly remarkable achievements in air pollution control, with ARB driving so much of that.
Well, needless to say, my heart pitter-pattered when I read the book. I love hearing all those great things about California. I love hearing all those great things about California and about CAR because I believe them with all my heart. But I do see difficulties translating what we have been able to do in California. And I get asked a lot, how did you do it? And how do we make that happen at the national level or the international level? That's always the question that comes to me. And I start with the fact that, we had enormous resources to invest in this project. Political resources because of the concerns of the public with smog, going back to the 50s when it was a front page story and, photos appeared and people were, the public, the people who actually make democracy do things with enough consensus that action has to be taken, were there behind regulation of the auto industry, and they have been all along, despite the occasional threat that certain models of vehicles would not be available in California. You'd never be able to get a Mustang again, or whatever. Chrysler was the major perpetrator of those. It just didn't work out that way, right? So we were right about what the technology could do, but we had the political muscle to be able to make it happen. And that was despite constant, really, backlash or resistance, less even from the industry itself than from other interested parties, in particular the dealers who really were concerned that there would be a shortage of attractive models that people would want to buy. And of course, because of the connection between the vehicle and the fuel, the really potent opponent for action, opponent to action, to tighten emission standards was always the oil industry, not the auto industry. People think it was the car companies, and certainly they would appear and regularly raise objections and bring lawsuits and so forth. There are a number of lawyers who, made their whole careers out of fighting California's vehicle regulations. But they, in many instances, the resistance was more tokenism, I think, in the sense that it was legal theory being perpetrated as opposed to a real sense that they couldn't do what it was that was being asked of them. I think back to the Montreal Protocol times, and I wasn't involved in the creation of it, but I did have the opportunity to come into US EPA in the Clinton era when we were busily implementing parts of it and have that as part of my mission at the Air Office, was that science was actually at the forefront. And I think the authors say this, but maybe they don't emphasize enough how after the protocol succeeded, a lot of people got smart about not just accepting the word of scientists that something had to be done because a problem was real. And this used to drive, I know, some of the leading climate scientists to despair. A decade and 2 decades ago, Al Gore, having been somebody who talked to a lot of those people, that they couldn't find a place to go to get anybody to listen to them, to pay attention to what needed to be done. And in part, that was because the people who didn't want to see tougher regulations had gotten much, much better at producing contrary science and scientists who would stand up and go out and argue against action of any kind. So in that sense, Ted, I do think it was a simpler time, and I do think it was a simpler problem. Fewer firms, fewer vested interests. Yes, it was an international problem, but really there were a few places in the world that were making and using most of the stuff that we needed to get rid of. And I agree with you to the extent that we were able to fudge a little bit. For example, the case of methyl bromide, which was one of the things that was supposed to be eliminated and is still being used on strawberries in California because the growers made a strong enough case that they couldn't make money without being able to use this chemical. And the only thing that has led to real reduction there is the public acceptance or demand for organic strawberries that has made it less necessary for the growers to use the product. But it seems to me that the basic analysis is pretty much right, but I guess we're going to get to this in the later discussion. What do you do with it when it comes to figuring out how to solve climate, which does affect many more countries with a compound that we're mostly focused on, which is ubiquitous and which in many ways is necessary to life as we know it. Can we really apply those lessons?
Great, thank you. So Steve, I want to turn to you, our second all-star ARB regulator. You worked at ARB, you went off to NHTSA, you came back to ARB. You've been deeply involved in a lot of the very technical aspects of regulation at ARB. We'd love to hear your thoughts on your kind of reflections on the theory here, but also the way the book characterizes ARB and the collaboration on the technological frontier.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Wonderful book, and we had a chance, Chuck and I were talking a bit ahead of time about my fascination with how he understood, or the authors understood, some of the things that would be hard to understand from the outside normally. And I was asking, did you speak to people about some of those details? Because that's very insider knowledge, some of it. And part of that was the way I looked at how the authors approached the question of this experimentalism and how that's applied to the clean cars work at CARB, was that they observed that not only was CARB able to demonstrate that it was technologically feasible because there were technologies that existed, but the willingness to sort of revisit that over time to sort of calm the industry, like, oh, we'll look at this, and we frankly do this today. Don't worry, we'll go back, we'll do tech assessments, we'll adjust if necessary. But also that kind of insider knowledge that working directly with the suppliers of technology and using that information as a way to develop the regulations to push manufacturers to do more was, I think, really insightful. And the way that I look at this as, yes, a regulator, but more generally somebody who is, trying to make change in government, is it's really about the tools that you have available. So protocols like this Montreal Protocol, these global treaties are one type of tool, but they're not the only tool. We have regulation at the state level. So you have statutory authority that can lead you to making regulations that address particular things. And if you have the political will, then you can push very hard. But there are many more tools. The convening power that government has, the ability to enforce, do research, gather data. There's all different sorts of tools that are part of that experimental tool chest. And so the way that CARB typically does this is we observe there's a problem, we gather information about that problem, develop an inventory, and then determine through that inventory what opportunities there are to reduce the emissions that lead to this problem. And then sort of tackle those first. Look at the technology, what's going to be easiest to do based on a number of different factors, including the legal authority, where we believe we have the greatest political will, and so forth. And altogether, that combined means that you might have to employ a different type of tool if you run out of road on a particular effort. So you can't get so far on a regulation because now you're stopped by litigation. Maybe you can collect new data and you hold a workshop, you hold a big convening where you get lots of people to talk about an issue, build public support, get new statutory authority, and go back and try again. That's just an example of the way that we do that. And it's interesting, when I went to NHTSA, Mary and I had lots of conversations about this, and the way that we kind of discuss it is about it being the California way. So I thought maybe the title of this could just be changed to The California Way.
That's the next book.
That's the next book. And just one quick story from NHTSA, that not related to climate. We were trying to understand, in the autonomy world, what sort of safety impacts exist for these automated vehicles. And the first question I ask is, all right, well, what sort of data do we have? Well, we don't have a lot of data. We don't have, this information. Automakers don't give this to us. Well, let's go get it. How do we do that? What tools do we have available? Well, it turns out gathering data at the federal level is very difficult. Mary congratulated me after we did this. She said, I may be the only person who knows how difficult it is to actually gather data at the federal level. The PRA is fun. But in fact, we were able to use some tools that were non-regulatory to get information and then build upon it. And that's the experimentalist approach, taking that mindset that we learned through lots of work at CARB, and then applying it to other problems is really a critical part of the work. And I really congratulate the authors. I think that kind of understanding those details, and as the person implementing it, I really think about what's the next tool that I need to employ in order to solve this problem. And the authors don't address it exactly that way, but I think they see that those tools exist and understood how that was applied throughout the process.
Can I ask you to follow up a little bit, both of you, on the relationships part of this, though? I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the theory of experimental governance is that it is built on, maybe it's contested collaboration, or it's uneasy or tense collaboration, but it is collaboration, and that requires a set of relationships that mature over time. They change as they go, and that's not something we typically think about. We often think about policy as take the tool, apply it to the problem.
Right. So can I just say, one of the things about CARB that most people don't realize is that many of the leaders in developing our regulatory programs are people who actually did time in the auto industry. I mean, they worked for car companies as students, as interns, or actually, in reasonably important positions, and made the decision that they wanted to jump over onto the government side because they were frustrated by how slow and difficult it was to get things done that they thought needed to be done to make the cars better and cleaner. The story of the zero-emission vehicle mandate, the ZEV mandate, is one that doesn't often get told, and it may be partly because the person who actually was responsible for that as the head of CARB was a woman who was a Republican appointee, and she wasn't there for very long, but she accomplished some very important things while she was there, and the ZEV mandate is one of them. And the reason for the ZEV mandate is that she took one of the trips to Japan that leaders of CARB typically did at least once during every 4-year term. A delegation would go over and visit all the Japanese automakers and be given the tour of everything they were doing and lectured about what was feasible and what wasn't. And it was very formal, but there was enough of a relationship that was built over time so that some engineers basically felt comfortable enough to approach the head of CARB, and when she was looking at the work that they were doing on battery electric vehicles, say to her, we're very afraid this program is going to be cut. It's being, we've been doing this for a long time. We're not really ready to introduce a product into the market. Our bosses are telling us that they're going to close this program down, and we could really use some help in moving this along. And she came back, and the result of that was a mandate to sell zero-emission vehicles. There's a tiny amount, ramping up over time, and even that had to be pushed back because, in fact, there weren't enough cars available, and there wasn't going to be an ability to conform or comply, and so CARB had to change the rule, leading us back to who killed the electric car, which is another story. But, I think that level of understanding is more than just trust, although trust is necessary also, and that was built up over time. It's a sense that each of the parties kind of understands what the other one can do and is looking for a way to leverage each other to do things that they think need to be done.
Yeah, and in addition to cars, of course, there's all sorts of other energy supply and clean energy installations in California that are innovating based on these policies. And so this idea that there's a close relationship between the regulator and those who are innovating in the field is a really critical part of ensuring that you maintain the support for a program and that compliance is possible. So this idea that there is a zero-emission vehicle, that the technology exists, is critical to demonstrate ahead of time that it's technologically feasible to promulgate a regulation. But more important is knowing that there are other things on the horizon. And so in addition to the auto manufacturers, It's meeting with the suppliers of the technology. And there are whole associations built around that. The manufacturers of emission control equipment, for example, is an association that comes to us, and they meet with us separately than their customers, which are those who purchase the technology, and they show us, this is a new thing that we have available. This is going to cut costs down to this level, whether it's a battery supply or it's a particulate filter or whatever it is to clean the air. Those technologies exist, and so this is on the horizon. This is something, if we push a little bit harder here, then this technology could cover it. And it turns out that we're wrong most of the time. We think we know that technology is going to work, and in fact it would, but there's something else we didn't know about. But we were comforted by the idea that at least there was this one thing. And so the knowledge that technology will develop over time, that we have the information that compliance is possible, then allows us to push, allows others to innovate, and then keep that kind of iterative process going. And in some cases, and the book talks about this, of course, and Mary just mentioned, you have to step back because the technology didn't develop as quickly as you imagine. Or in some cases, you have to jump forward because the technology is developing faster than you imagine. In the case of trucks, clean trucks, zero-emission trucks, we developed a regulation that just a few years ago looked like a huge push. Along comes the Inflation Reduction Act with $40,000 tax credit, maybe you're going to talk about.
Perfect segue. There you go.
And in fact, those regulations don't look like they will be as binding as we thought at the time. So now we'll have to revisit that based on this because you want the regulations to continue to push. That iterative process is really critical.
So let's get our tax and trade policy expert into the mix here, and then I definitely want to give Chuck and David some time to respond to all that they've heard. But Kim Klausing, I want to turn to you, and you've worked for many years on trade and tax policy, both of which obviously are becoming central to climate policy. The last chapter of the book sort of pivots in some ways from the rest of the book and engages with trade in particular and develops a new account of globalization that, as I read it, tries to harness and elaborate some of the commitments of experimentalist governance. The book was also published, I think, just before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, but I'm sure the authors have some thoughts on that. So, Kim, give us your thoughts on how this connects to trade policy and tax policy and maybe your reactions to the last chapter's discussion of trade and globalization.
Yes, thanks for inviting me to be here, despite the fact that I'm probably the least expert in this area compared to everyone else up here. I very much enjoyed this conversation and all of these perspectives. I think while I was listening to everyone talk here, I was reminded of that, is it the Beach Boys song, I Wish They All Could Be California? Because one of the questions I had reading this book is, if you're thinking about this as a problem where every actor is sort of like Norway or California, it looks very different than when you're thinking about it as the mother of all global externalities, right? So I think when we're thinking about how we push technological change and experimentation in a range of industries, if all the consumers and all the producers were in the EU and California, I think we have a really tidy solution here. I think one of my concerns is what are the incentives that drive the rest of the world, like Appalachia, like the ASEAN countries, like Sub-Saharan Africa, like China, like India. If you kind of look at US emissions, I think they're about 14% of the world totals. So that still leaves 86 that is something else. If you add the EU in, you're still left with, well over 3/4 of the emissions being somewhere else. So we have this problem of how to, what are the incentives that we can create that cause whatever is good that's happening in California and Europe to move to those other places, right? But one thing we need to be aware of is that in a way, even when we're doing the right things in California and Europe, we're consuming stuff from all those other places, right? So our consumption carbon footprints look very different from our production carbon footprints, and that's really spectacularly true in places like California, which may have very clean production. But if you kind of unpack the things that you're buying, it's not entirely clear that your consumption is as clean as your production. So the United States has, as a nation, beyond California, finally made some progress with the Inflation Reduction Act. It was far from what I would view as ideal, but it did entail an enormous amount of spending on a long laundry list of tax cuts to really motivate private enterprise to try a bunch of different things. I think one of the problems with the US approach, if you contrast it to, say, the European approach, is it's not very rules-based, it's not very contextualized in the world economy, and I think those two things are potentially highly problematic. So if you take, for instance, our large hydrogen tax credits, kind of imply that we could get hydrogen, which looks like it could cost, $30 to $67 per kilojoule. The tax credits correspond to about $25 that we could kind of lop off that cost. The Europeans are also subsidizing hydrogen, but they're subsidizing it in a context where they know down the road, 10 years from now, coal and natural gas are going to be $14 to $20 per kilojoule, whereas in the United States, those fuels are more like $3 to $5 per kilojoule. So when you're trying to make decisions that are going out decades long about how industries should transform, and you don't know whether you're ever going to make fossil fuel expensive in the United States, which we seem to lack the will to do, right? That does limit how useful some of your policy tools can be. Plus, how do we know that all of this will even come to pass when the United States has a highly dysfunctional political system, and we don't know whether that funding will continue into the future, and we also don't know that the other supporting policies will even be there, right? Whereas in Europe, that they're trying to make fossil fuels expensive at the exact same time. Another interesting thing that we did in the context of all of these tax credits is we built in national content requirements in many cases. So for the case of electric vehicles, even for wind and solar, there are adders for domestic steel content and the like. This is not a rules-based approach. This is the opposite of that, where you're kind of okay, we're going to try to do some good things for the climate, but we've also decided to put a huge thumb on the scale in favor of things that happen here, right? This is actually alienated, many of our closest partners and friends, the Canadians, because they protested ahead of time, managed to get our national content to include, North America is part of the nation now, but also other free trade area partners, right? But it's not clear. The Europeans have been less lucky. Korea is not happy, so one does have to be careful in thinking about the incentives that are creating writ large for the world to solve these problems. So one concern I had a little bit with the arguments at the end of the book is it seemed to be a little bit dismissive of the role that a WTO rules-based system can play. Because one of the nice things about the EU actions is they've been occurring within a context where that's respected. So when they levy carbon prices in their economies, which they do, they also worry about leakage where their consumers might buy things from abroad, and so they imagine doing things like a carbon border adjustment, but they imagine doing it in the context of also raising costs in Europe, right? So it's kind of fair to tell, not perfectly fair given history, but it's fairer to tell countries elsewhere that their products will also face this cost, right? Whereas the United States approach, there's now a bill that is being considered in a bipartisan way of sort of saying well, we could just levy tariffs on dirty things from other countries, and never mind that we're not requiring anyone to pay costs here, right? We're going to hope that inspires them to do better. So I think one useful role that these international institutions can play is constraining the ways in which countries foist their policy goals onto each other to be more productive and coherent, right? And so I think having a global architecture, and obviously you guys do a great job explaining that Paris is the conscience of the, and I think the conscience is really important too, but also having an architecture that sort of sets the rules about how do we make sure that the technology isn't hoarded, but rather spills over? How do we make sure that these tariffs are actually serving a rules-based system and aren't just penalizing countries and holding them to a higher standard than we hold ourselves? I think that lattice of international agreement is extremely important in this area because of how global this problem is. And you really want to be able to kind of bring the world along so that they don't feel like they're being, bullied by the likes of the United States. So as one example, I think we could take critical minerals, which are going to be key to the energy transition. There's China is the dominant provider or refiner of almost all of these critical minerals. So you can kind of look at a bar chart of almost any important thing that goes into, the green energy transition. And you're going to see that, China is a key player. The United States has talked about, well, we need to diversify supply chains and encourage that to be, less dependent on one country and more broad. But the United States does this in the context of this Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which is, I think, in a way, similar to what you would argue is an open plurilateral arrangement, or I forget what your OPAs are. But the problem with the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum is that there's just very little incentive for the other countries to be anywhere near that thing, right? So they look at it. I was just talking to some of the people a week ago about this from other countries, and they're like, it seems like the United States wants to give us a lot of rules, but they don't want to give us absolutely anything, in exchange, right? The classic free trade agreement, you get market access in exchange for all this stuff. The new US approach is to be like, well, we don't want to do the part where we do something for you, but we'd love very much for you to have these higher standards. So I think part of the difficulty with moving away from the classic free trade agreement or moving away from these rules is that you get countries just kind of throwing their will around without spreading the desire for positive policy change. And I worry a little bit that we're kind of in that equilibrium right now with this current situation. So I appreciate more the European approach, which is to say, we still need to keep these rules of non-discrimination. We still need to make sure that we have something to offer the other countries when they come to the table on this. And I think that that's something the United States could learn from and sort of thinking about ways to use the WTO and other institutions to push this forward, because our consumption is as important as our production in sort of solving this problem. And trade can be an enormously important lever. If you look at the current pattern of protection in the world economy, it's massively tilted towards dirty products, right? There's almost no tariffs on things like coal and oil and the dirtier products, and there's quite high tariffs on things that are often key parts of the transition. So one area which I think the WTO could usefully be resuscitated around, if we wanted to like the WTO again, would be sort of to look at that whole area and say, how can we make the world trading system more friendly towards the sharing of technology ideas and the kind of gains from experimentation that you show that are so important? How do we make sure that those flow freely across borders? And I think we're going to need institutions like the WTO to make sure that that happens.
Sounds like you got out of the government just in time. I do think this is being recorded, but we will not send it to Washington. I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A with the audience, and we can go a little past 7. But before we open it up, you should be thinking about your questions. I want to give Chuck and David a chance to respond or engage on anything that they have heard, and it's a lot out on the table right now. So I'm not sure how you want to divide it up, but just fire
Well, let me
away.
take a quick pass through and then we do the same. These are all enormously helpful, and I mean this sincerely. It's not a throwaway line. I'm not good at that. I'm not. They're really illuminating. So let me rapidly go through with a promise to those who want to take up on it of a rain check of a further discussion. Ted, you raised a number of very sophisticated objections about the differences between Montreal and Kyoto, and then features within Montreal itself. And I won't go through them all. Let me just focus on one that you yourself highlighted about the character of deliberation being technocratic. You're right. You're right. And this was a judgment call of authors, because what you said was the sense you get. There are other aspects, for example, consultation of civil populations, about inhalers and so on. But the core, it's, the way we're using deliberation generally doesn't line up with your account, as you just gave it here, and your account is not singular. It sounds right. It is right. So on the other points, we come back, but you're just right on that. And potential authors, when you're wrong, say it. So, Mary, you said a wide range of interesting things, I mean, especially about political will, but I want to focus on one aspect that William called attention to, and that was just to focus for a second about the question of this tense collaboration between, and there were a bunch of words to the, you know, it's, and if I understood correctly, you said, well, it's trust, but that's really not the sum of it. And I think that's absolutely right. And I you know, kind of, earlier, I have a bunch of ways of characterizing this counterintuitive set of suspicious alliances, people who are, it isn't that they distrust each other, it's that they're vigilant in a way that is inconsistent with our familiar idea of trust, which shades into blind trust, and the kind of collaboration we're talking about is anything but blind trust. So I say that because that frames Steve's remarks. I mean, an odd reaction, but what you said, Steve, sounds so straightforward, so natural, so much the obviously right way to proceed under the circumstances, that the wonder of it is that people don't say this all the time, that it takes an odd occasion like this for somebody to say, oh, you know, if the statute doesn't, then we do this. But the basic point is, once you have this idea of pushing beyond the boundary subject to feasibility constraints, the idea that you're limited by the, I don't want to say the mere statute, but limited by black letter law or laws it's interpreted by administrative lawyers, the Supreme Court, that's just wrong. And I think I think the California miracle is unintelligible without an understanding that people have come to such an understanding. And that may be a partial answer, Mary, to the question about what else people are going to do, which is, you know, sort of more of you, more of Steve, more of, okay. Kim, you raise a number of fundamental questions, so I want to break this into two parts. One is the question of the South. And you're obviously right that if it's just Norway, that won't be enough, admirable though the Norwegians are, and so on. But the hope of the book is actually that the disparities that you're talking about lead to contests and struggles over the allocation of power, the creation of rules that begin to reestablish a balance. So the argument is not, if we just proceed, it will be fine. It will be that precisely because the way we're proceeding is manifestly unjust, it will, and we are dependent on those people in a way that we didn't fully realize until now, the issue will be posed, whether it's solved to the satisfaction of the world and, you know, the gods of climate, we don't know. Okay, so the clearest sign of this, for example, is palm oil or deforestation. So the carbon costs of palm oil borne by Indonesia. We consume palm oil, bad palm oil, and that doesn't appear in our carbon budget. If we export oil, the costs of burning the oil go to the consumers. And you can look at the ferocious exchange. The Brazilians are producing one paper after another, denouncing, and correctly. So I think the situation you described is untenable for the reason you're saying. I think that untenability doesn't mean that there'll be a happy resolution, but something's going to happen. And finally, on this question of a rules-based order, the idea of these open plurilateral agreements is to have groups of nations, which would include a combination of northern and southern, as the case might be, to have groups of nations agree on standards that they share, and which would be open to new adherents if they meet those standards. Okay, so it's not a non-rules-based system. It's based on the emergence of islands of ruledness in these separate commodity areas. We have plenty of examples of that emerging, or maybe not emerging, in steel and so on and so forth. But where we might disagree is whether the WTO, whether the idea of rule boundness that's associated with this alternative fully meets the idea of rule boundedness and I would say it doesn't. Too bad for the old idea of rule boundedness, not for the idea of rules, just the idea of rule boundedness can change.
Thanks. I'm mindful of the time, so let me just say, first of all, what a joy to have a conversation about ideas and such important questions with regard to their ultimate implications for climate change. I want to say 5 things in response. The first is Steve raised this question of how we got inside the CARB story. Did we have the tapes from the NSA or something like that? These are hard histories to write. And so those of you out there who are students and are sitting through some class and the class is going through some theory and you think to yourself, boy, I'd rather be at the dentist having a root canal right now. There's a huge value to theory, which is it helps you really, you're testing the theory with evidence, but it's helping you look for what matters. And in a lot of these cases, what you're really looking for is what's motivating the few firms that are going to break out from the pack. How is the regulator getting information to be able to set rules and adjust rules and so on? And so there's just a tremendous value of having a theoretical lens for rethinking the role of history and then for also guiding what you're trying to do as a policymaker. Second is, I really appreciate what Mary said about the special origins of the zero-emission vehicle, the first zero-emission vehicle arrangement. To me, what's astonishing about that history is how the rule changed from being, a battery rule initially to then a rule that did totally different things, and how impossible that would have been for the regulator had they not had confederates from the industry, either people who moved over or firms from the industry that broke from the pack and worked with the regulator. And I think that's the larger story there. It will be great to watch how this unfolds with regard to the new CARB rules on electric vehicles. Because we have a new, very, very ambitious rule. The technology seems to be more mature, but is the technology ready for 100%? Nobody knows, it's unknowable. But it'll be a similar kind of process where the rule is a start, the goal is a start, and then we're working through this. The third thing I want to pick up on is what is really where Chuck was talking with regard to Ted's comments on deliberation. And Ted also raised the question to us about concentrated authority. Does the authority need to be concentrated or distributed? And this is an area where our early writing, before as we were getting ready to write what became this book, was off, because there was a lot of discussion about bottom-up approaches to addressing climate change and other kinds of problems. We use some of that bottom-up language. I think that language has gotten in the way. This is not top-downism or bottom-upism. It's a combination of both. It's decentralizing the search process and centralizing the process of expert evaluation of what works and what doesn't work so that you can then figure out how to adjust the rules, how to change the standards inside the industry. The fourth thing I want to talk about is this kind of granddaddy, this global externality that, as Kim articulated it. I think the mother of all externalities. I think the implication of this is what's now being done by the leading governments, which is, let's not think about this as a kind of global emissions problem, but we've got a series of sectors where the solutions vary in every sector. There are questions about what are the right boundaries around sectors, and that will have to be worked on and adjusted over time. And you're working with the firms and the governments that are most motivated to go change facts on the ground in those sectors. And all that's going to require working mainly outside the formal intergovernmental process. The formal intergovernmental process because of this history, maybe because ozone was so successful, everyone was kind of primed to make it, all the incumbents were primed to make climate fail. And so you're going to have to work outside the sclerosis and the consensus decision-making of that, and also work outside to create incentives. And that's going to include trade measures of the type, I think both the punitive trade measures, but then also the opportunity trade measures. You know, it's easy to forget that the reason solar is the dominant technology today is because of global investment and trade opportunities. It was brought down, technology was improved in particular markets, but then is now available globally because of the markets, at least until recently, were relatively open. And that's a key part of the success story that has to be replicated. And the last thing I'll talk about is just the fifth thing to close here is about followership. I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that US emissions are maybe 12, 14% of global emissions and shrinking. California is less than 1% and shrinking. The European Union is maybe 10 or 11% and shrinking. The kind of irony of the climate problem is that the leaders that go off and do things become less relevant to the problem the more they lead. And so the way that leadership generates solutions that are globalized solutions is through followership. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that what we're trying to do here in this applying the logic of experimentalism and working on the climate problem sector by sector is destabilize industries, create new technologies, and make it riskier for firms that invest in the old technologies to keep doing that. And by generating that new dynamic, that new industrial organization, you generate followership.
Great. So let's take a couple of questions, if anybody has a question. We have a mic there. Michael, if you want to come up to the mic and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Michael Ross in the Political Science Department. This was such a great panel, so just let me get that out of the way. It is so rare to hear some new ideas, and I heard a lot of them tonight. I want to press David and Charles on this key, intriguing idea of turning essentially polluters into allies, into innovators. I can see how that works in Montreal, where you have DuPont, a diversified chemical manufacturer, where CFCs are just a small part of their business, and they're good at innovating and making new things. We're talking now about climate, we're talking about fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry. When we speak about these companies, these are highly undiversified companies. They're incredibly sclerotic and almost impossible to diversify out of oil and gas, at least in my view. Is it possible really to turn them into allies and innovators, or does the fossil fuel industry need to just get out of the way or die and be replaced by new energy companies?
Do we get to vote?
Let me guess where your vote is, Mary.
I think the panel's going to be unanimous.
Well, I don't, I hope that's the outcome too. But let me just say that I don't think it's right to say that these big fossil fuel companies are totally sclerotic in the sense that they have a set of fixed routines that can be applied and only applied to the extraction of fossil fuels, and that they're not capable of redeploying that. So most of these firms are super high technology firms in seismology, in autonomously guided subsea vehicles, in super sophisticated materials handling. These companies have enormous capabilities. If you want to see, look at Statoil. I know it's Norwegian, they don't count, too nice, but Statoil and the Norwegian offshore industry has moved from being an extraction industry to a capital goods industry, and from there they're going to diversify into all kinds of other things. So on the one hand, I think it's an absolutely reasonable question, and it's not that I harbor some fond feeling for resurrecting these miscreants. Whatever happens is fine. But I don't think it would be right to write off the vast capacity that they have demonstrably accumulated.
I'll just say briefly, I think the answer as to whether the new ideas are going to come from outside the industry in the form of new entrants or from inside the industry in the form of existing firms not becoming prisoners of the innovator's dilemma and actually doing something new, it's going to vary by sector. The power industry in most of the world is now switching, partly because many of them have learned, as indeed all the California companies have learned, is that it's more lucrative for them to be wires companies and to be a little more agnostic as to what generates electricity that goes on the wires. That's not true everywhere in the world, but it's the only sector that's making, across the world, progress in terms of reducing emissions, which is lucky because it's so important for decarbonization. Oil and gas, I think it's too early to tell. I'm really struck, and let me build on Chuck's theoretical point about the theory, which is what I see in the industry is some oil and gas companies decided they had to do something about climate and they went into renewables, solar and wind. They're terrible at that. And so they got their heads handed to them, and not surprisingly, in the last earnings calls, after the embarrassing statements about how much they made last year, they're all rolling back from doing conventional solar and wind because it was just stupid. Whereas what Statoil has gone so far as to change his name to Equinor so that nobody even knows what it means, because what does Equinor mean? It doesn't have any obvious meaning. And it's going to become a carbon management company, more or less, and it may fail, it may blow itself up, or it may succeed, who knows. So I think that industry is really very much in flux. And the last example is aviation. I was 10 days ago in London with the Jet Zero program, which is the British government's effort to organize the aviation industry to get serious about climate. And what's really interesting is the industry by itself can't deal with the problem, because the industry's solution is to do the same things it's good at doing. But if the climate problem caused by aviation is not just CO2, but also contrails, and there's quite a lot of science to suggest that contrails are actually a bigger part of the problem than CO2, you need different kinds of propulsion. You need hydrogen, you need electric. And so those innovations are coming from outside the industry. And so it's not the industry that's leading it, it's the government that's helping to orchestrate the experiments where probably the big ideas are going to come from the outside.
Thank you. My name is Paul Scott, and I'm an EV activist. Is that on?
No,
Can you
it's
guys-
not.
No, it is.
There, thank you. Thank you. So Mary and I have had interactions in the past, and I just want to say that it's particularly pleasant to understand that we are now within sight of killing the internal combustion industry completely. So of all the environmental issues that CARB deals with and other environmentalists deal with, this is the first time in history that we're going to kill an industry dead and it will never come back, because they need scale. And they can't have scale when the electric cars are selling in the entire market. So my question is, what will CARB do, and in terms of transportation regulation, when all the cars are electric, and the only thing that's left are the existing gas cars that are aging out, and that we still have electricity generation to deal with, we still have food, agriculture, and things like that. But will you be regulating cars in the future when they are all electric?
I'm retired.
And I hope to retire someday. Well, yes, and there's actually a lot of work now and a lot of question about the efficiency of the vehicle. So for example, there's much larger vehicles that are much less efficient just by their nature because of the weight. That's one issue. But the other issue is just, the vehicle itself can become much more efficient, lowers cost, lowers weight, and you get more value to the customer. The new regulations also have in them provisions for battery life and the types of things that consumers might expect with those vehicles. So certainly those types of things will go on. But rather than focus just on the electric vehicle, which clearly 26, 27 million vehicles on California's roads, we got to get them all electric as quickly as possible. We really have to rethink transportation, and that is something that CARB is involved in. And we talk about VMT, vehicle miles traveled, as a metric that needs to be reduced. Clearly that's true, but the important part of it is the car is sort of the worst way to get around. Mary was stuck in traffic. We know that it's challenging. It's a very expensive thing for society. And not only does it feed into this mother of all externalities, and in California it's the largest emitting sector, but it's expensive and it's inequitable, and it really doesn't serve society well. So rethinking transportation is a big part of CARB's work, and it's fundamental to actually achieving the long-term goals. As part of that, we've got to make everything that's on the road zero emissions, buses, trucks, and so forth. I wanted to touch just on this one other piece, which is, yes, we need to watch the cars, and getting to 100% is critical in the car space. But watch the truck space. This is where a lot of innovation is occurring and where a lot of the investment is occurring, because you're going from diesel, which has all these other problems, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but it's killing people in communities. It's toxic carcinogens that spew out of the tailpipe. That's where the innovation is. You both have to make that engine cleaner and go to electric at the same time. And so there is a lot of innovation that's happening in that area as well. And as an EV enthusiast, you probably understand, the battery problem, the efficiency problem is bigger, but the economic incentive is there in ways that it's not in the personal mobility space. We own a car, it's free to drive when it's electric. We actually are going to drive more. I certainly do, because it's cheap. That's not going to be the case in trucks. And so that economic incentive is something that's really critical to watch.
So we're already 10 minutes over, and we do have a reception out here, but before we close and go to the reception, I do want to do just a lightning round. I'll start with Mary, and we'll work all the way up. And it's an impossible question. Aside from reading this book, what is the most important thing we, and you can define we however you want to, should be doing to fix the climate? Mary.
So I think it was David who referred to thinking differently by sectors rather than globally, and I completely am in agreement with that for everybody, for whatever sector you are in or might be going into. Transportation being a sector of its own. I'm spending a lot of my time now with something called the Commission on Reimagining Mobility for exactly this reason, that we have to think differently about how we get ourselves and goods around, what we're trying to accomplish. And some of the best people in the world from different parts of that sector are coming together to try to trade some ideas about this. But it's it's got to be oriented around people, not about the machines. So in that sense, I think all of us are guilty. I certainly have been in the past, because I'm a believer that technology can solve problems, and we can use our ingenuity and create opportunities and all of that. And I still believe that, but there are some things relating to climate that are so much more fundamental that we're going to have to focus on. That's not lightning.
Steve.
Well, I'm most concerned not about CO2 in the near term, but about short-lived climate pollutants like methane. And so in that, there's actually many things that individuals can do to change their behavior to reduce methane emissions, everything from eating less meat to drinking less milk to watching what you consume and therefore throw away. Food waste is a huge contributor to methane emissions. And just as a quick plug, one of the things that California is doing is actually putting up satellites so that we can better measure methane emissions, because you can't control what you can't measure. So, but as consumers, and I'm guilty of this, I love my lattes in the morning. But going to oat milk, I know some in the audience do this. I haven't, there's a particular audience member I know here. But eating less meat and living a more sustainable lifestyle is actually something that's relatively easy to do, and of course it's also more healthful. So there's many advantages to that. So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah.
I've got three things in there really quick. One, vote, because the policymakers and the courts are really going to decide the incentive systems for the world, and so by all means do that. 2, do a carbon footprint calculator and try to actually learn what are the important things that you do and what are the unimportant things you do, because a lot of the painful things actually don't make a difference at all. Like, and some of the, living near where you work and avoiding a couple flights could mean that you can make 1,000 mistakes about whether you turn on the light or not. So figure that out. And then some of you are going to go on to be wealthy lawyers, and I also think people should think in their positions of privilege about philanthropy and ways that you can contribute to others who, even if you're not like on the ground rolling up your sleeves, other people can be, and many of you will have the resources to do that. So think philanthropically too.
Thanks for the impossible question, William. I think I've also got 3. 1, these guys really have a great idea in carving up the emissions problem into appropriate sub-problems of manageable sectoral scope where you can think coherently about it. So think hard about the scope of effort, investment, innovation, and regulation, and don't forget the ag and land use sector. 2, think hard about defensible, just, and rational boundaries between rate of emission cuts, rate of promoting removals and adaptation. And 3, it's really painful, but we have to start thinking in a coherent way about solar geoengineering and other potential active interventions as stopgaps while other stuff slowly ramps up in the environment of, like, we don't know how fast the changes are going to be.
Well, I guess I would listen to my friends and colleagues. Good ideas. What's the one thing that I'm really focused on? I'm interested in identifying the firms and governments that are willing or motivated to destabilize the status quo. My COVID hobbies I had 2 COVID hobbies of the kind of work type. One was I joined the advisory board of a company that measures methane real time, and we can certify essentially zero emission methane. So we now need UC campuses to buy methane leak-free gas, destabilize the market, create new facts on the ground. My other COVID hobby was I was part of that team at Engine Number 1 that went after Exxon and removed several of their board members, which was fun. I'm not sure it actually had much of an impact on what Exxon's doing, but it had a big impact on the rest of the industry. So I think the way you change facts on the ground is you find firms and governments that are willing to, that are motivated to shift, and then the rest is not follow automatically, but it's how you get started.
I'm a little at a loss because I find it hard to focus on one thing at a time. But and leaving aside the question of what one could do in one's own life, that is the question, but I want to put that aside because preferences vary and there are lots of urgent things that one could do with one's life that would make things better. I was very drawn to Mary's suggestion because it points to the lesson of decarbonization as much as to the process itself. And the lesson is, I think, about how we live together and how we want to be as people with one another, mediated by technology, but not reduced to the technology. And I think that this is a moment where the veil of inevitability, where the technology is what it necessarily has to be, that veil is being lifted so that without pretending that we can just choose freely and among choices of our own design, nonetheless, there's a sense that inevitability is less necessary, and there may be things which seem implausible which could take on reality. And I think that starting with where Mary started, which is that this is not, in the end, once we've gotten this far with the technology, we see this is not a technology problem. I would like to hope that if lots of people had that view, it would make a contribution to our well-being.
Well, on that, I'm sorry we didn't get more questions. We do have the reception. You can definitely come and ask questions. There are books available. Please join me in thanking Chuck and David and all of our panelists.